The morning light rolled over the Wyoming plains like a tide of molten gold, spilling across the brittle grass and the faded boards of McAllister Ranch. The silence broke with the clatter of hooves and the metallic rattle of a corral gate. Men shouted, dust churned, and in the middle of that storm of motion stood the creature everyone had learned to fear, the black stallion they called Diablo. His mane lashed like fire, his eyes wild as lightning in a storm. Every muscle in his body rippled with defiance as he struck the ground, the echo ringing like a gunshot across the valley. 2 ranch hands scrambled to safety, one clutching his arm, the other cursing under his breath. No one dared get close again. They said Diablo had been caught from the wild 3 months ago. Some claimed he'd belonged to no herd at all, that he was born of thunder and wind, untamed by the laws of men or beasts. What was certain was his hatred for ropes, for fences, for every hand that reached toward him. Each attempt to break him had ended the same way, with blood, bruises, and broken pride. He stood now in the middle of the pen, sweat steaming off his coat in the chill air, his breath sharp and white. Around him, the men muttered, "He ain't worth the feed. Send him off before he kills someone. Some animals just don't belong in cages." At the far end of the corral, a figure leaned on the rail, silent. Elias McGraw had seen enough of men and horses to know the truth behind their noise. 68 years had worn his body thin, but his eyes still carried the sharpness of someone who had lived his life reading what others missed, the twitch of an ear, the flare of a nostril, the quiet language that passed between prey and predator. He wasn't dressed like the others. His coat was old, his boots cracked, his hat stained by weather and time. He had no rope, no whip, no spurs. Only a stillness that seemed to settle the air around him. The ranch owner, Mason Holt, spotted him and frowned. "You don't belong here, old man," he said, walking over with a clipboard in hand. "This one's a lost cause. We're sending him to the auction by week's end." Elias didn't move his gaze from the stallion. "He's not angry," he said quietly. "He's scared." Mason snorted. "Scared? That horse nearly killed 2 men this morning. You want to talk fear? Try standing in there with him." Elias's voice carried the calm of someone who'd buried his shouting years ago. Fear and anger come from the same place. You don't break either with force. "Yeah." Mason leaned closer, lowering his voice. "And what do you know about it, mister?" Elias finally turned his head. His eyes were pale gray, like weathered stone. "Enough to know that horse ain't the devil. He's just been treated like one." The ranch hands glanced between them. They'd heard rumors. The name Elias McGraw carried a shadow of respect among older trainers. Once, decades ago, he'd been known for taming the wildest horses west of the Missouri. But his fame had ended in tragedy, the details long buried. Now he was just a wanderer who showed up in small towns and vanished before anyone could remember his face. Mason crossed his arms. "Even if you were who I think you are, you're too old to play hero. I've got men who can't handle that thing, and they've got their bones intact. You want to end up under his hooves." Elias looked back toward the pen, where Diablo pawed at the dirt, snorting clouds of fury. "Let me try," he said simply. A laugh rippled through the group. Someone spat into the dust. "You serious, Grandpa?" But Elias didn't blink. "Give me 3 days," he said. "If I can't get near him by then, send him off to your auction. I won't stop you." Mason hesitated, caught between disbelief and curiosity. "You think you can do what a dozen men couldn't?" "I think I can try without making him hate the effort," Elias replied. There was something in his tone, steady, almost mournful, that made Mason pause. The old cowboy's voice didn't boast. It carried weight, the kind that came from regret more than pride. Mason finally shrugged. 3 days. But if he throws you, I'm not responsible for what happens." "Wouldn't dream of blaming anyone," Elias said, lifting his hat slightly in thanks. The men drifted away, muttering bets under their breath. Only Elias stayed, watching Diablo circle the pen. The stallion's muscles rippled beneath his dark coat, his eyes flashing with distrust. Elias could see the scars along his flank, marks from ropes, maybe spurs. He recognized the language of pain etched into every movement. It wasn't defiance that drove the animal, it was memory. When the ranch emptied out for supper, Elias walked closer to the fence. The stallion's head snapped toward him, nostrils flaring. For a moment, the world held its breath. The old man didn't reach out. He didn't speak. He simply stood, one hand resting on the wood, his breathing slow, steady, matching the rhythm of the horses. Minutes passed. Diablo's ears flicked, uncertain. He stamped once, twice, but didn't back away. The air between them seemed to hum with something neither fully understood. Elias thought of another horse, long ago, a mare named Rose, wild and red as the setting sun. He had tamed her once with patience and a whisper, and lost her with a single mistake. That loss had driven him off the trails and into silence. He hadn't trained since. But now, looking into the stallion's eyes, he felt the old ache stir again. The same fire that once taught him how to listen. "Not your fault, is it, boy?" he murmured, the words carried away by the wind. "Men break what they fear." The stallion huffed, shaking his mane, but the tension in his stance softened. It was a tiny shift, one only a man like Elias would notice, but it was enough. Hope flickered, fragile as a match in the dark. Mason's voice cut through the quiet from across the yard. "Don't get yourself killed, old-timer." Elias tipped his hat without looking back. "I'll keep that in mind." The sun dipped behind the hills, staining the sky in streaks of amber and red. Shadows stretched long over the corral, and the stallion's silhouette stood framed against the dying light, a monument of raw power and pain. Elias stayed until darkness settled, then turned to leave. Behind him, Diablo gave a low, uncertain snort, almost like a question. The sound stopped Elias mid-step. He glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We'll talk tomorrow," he whispered. He walked toward the small cabin on the edge of the property, the faint glow of a lantern flickering through its window. Behind him, in the quiet of the corral, the black stallion pawed once at the dirt and watched the old man disappear into the night. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of that prairie, something had shifted, the first stirrings of trust, thin as dawn light, but alive all the same. And for the first time in a long while, Elias McGraw felt the stir of purpose return to his chest. He didn't know whether he was saving the stallion or himself. But by morning, he would find out. The morning broke cold and silver, mist curling low around the corral, like smoke from an old fire. Elias McGraw stood at the fence long before anyone else stirred, coffee steaming in his weathered hand. Diablo was already awake, pacing the enclosure, breath puffing through the fog in rhythmic bursts. The stallion's dark coat gleamed with dew, and his muscles tensed with each shift of weight, a creature forever poised between fight and flight. Elias watched in silence, tracing each movement with the precision of a man reading scripture. Every flick of the ear, every sidelong glance, spoke of a mind too sharp for brute force. This wasn't a beast to be conquered. This was something that needed understanding. The gate creaked behind him, breaking the quiet. Mason Holt's boots crunched against the frost-hardened ground. "Morning," he muttered, his tone carrying more skepticism than greeting. "Didn't think you'd actually show up." Elias didn't look back. "You thought I'd change my mind." "I figured you'd remember what broken bones feel like." Mason leaned against the post, arms folded. "You sure you're up for this? That horse doesn't forgive mistakes." Elias set his coffee cup on the fence, his gray eyes soft but firm. "Neither do I." The younger man smirked but said nothing more. He stayed to watch, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable failure. Elias stepped toward the corral slowly, his boots leaving shallow prints in the frost. Diablo stopped pacing. The air tightened. For a heartbeat, man and horse stood perfectly still, each measuring the other. Elias knew better than to rush. The language of trust was written in silence, not motion. He stopped just outside the gate and slipped his gloves off. "Mornin', boy," he said softly, voice calm as creek water. "Let's start over, you and me." Diablo's ears flicked at the sound. He didn't bolt, but his body coiled, ready. Elias moved in a slow arc, not directly toward him, but sideways, always keeping his eyes low. The stallion tracked him, snorting once, tail swishing like a warning. Elias began to hum under his breath, a low, tuneless vibration that carried through the cold. The rhythm wasn't for the horse's understanding, but for his own steadiness. It kept the tremor from his hands, the ache from memory. A gust of wind swept through, rattling the corral boards. Diablo flinched, muscles tightening. Elias stopped where he was, grounding himself. "Easy," he murmured, as if to the air itself. "No one's here to hurt you." Minutes passed like hours. Slowly, Diablo's stance shifted, his head lowering just enough to show he wasn't ready to fight, but not ready to yield either. Elias took a single step closer. The stallion didn't move. Another step, then another. When he was close enough to smell the warmth off the animal's skin, he stopped again, not daring to bridge the last distance. His heart thudded in his chest. He raised his hand, not to touch, only to offer. Diablo snorted, eyes rolling white, then took 2 backward steps. The connection shattered like glass. Elias exhaled, long and patient. "That's all right," he said quietly. "You've been through worse, haven't you?" From behind, Mason called, "That's it? You're going to talk him into obedience?" Elias didn't turn. Talking never tamed anything. Listening did. The younger man shook his head and left, muttering something about old fools and lost causes. When the sound of boots faded, only the wind remained. Elias stood there another hour, saying nothing. By the time the sun rose higher, Diablo had stopped circling. He stood still, watching the old cowboy with wary eyes, as though curious despite himself. That afternoon, Elias returned with no rope, no whip, no halter. Only an apple in his hand, its red skin gleaming. He sat on an overturned bucket just inside the pen and began to peel it with a small knife. The rhythmic scrape of metal against fruit filled the quiet. Diablo stayed near the far side, ears flicking with each sound. Elias let the slices fall into the dirt beside him. He didn't offer them, didn't coax. He simply waited. When dusk painted the sky orange, the stallion finally moved, one hesitant step, then another. He stopped a few feet away, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scent. His gaze flicked between Elias and the fruit, torn between suspicion and hunger. Elias didn't move. "Go on," he whispered. "It's yours." The horse stretched his neck forward, lips brushing the ground near the apple slice, then snatched it up and backed away fast. Elias smiled faintly. "Smart boy." That night, alone in his small cabin, Elias sat by the window, watching the corral bathed in moonlight. Diablo stood near the fence now, closer than before. Progress, however small, had its own kind of beauty, but the quiet also brought the ghosts. He thought of Rose again, the mare who had once taught him patience, and the storm that took her from him. He remembered shouting, the flash of lightning, the weight of her body lying still in the mud. The guilt had stayed with him all these years, heavy as a saddle across his shoulders. He wondered if taming Diablo was his way of asking for forgiveness, though he wasn't sure from whom. By morning, frost rimmed the corral fence, turning each rail to glass. Elias returned, moving slower than before. The stallion was already watching him. This time, Elias brought no food. Instead, he carried only a soft piece of cloth, the kind used for wiping sweat after a ride. He held it in his open palm, letting it flutter lightly in the breeze. Diablo flinched at first, muscles rippling, but the old man didn't retreat. He waited until the horse's breathing slowed again, then crouched low and set the cloth on the ground between them. Hours passed like that, neither touching, neither speaking. Just 2 creatures learning how to share space without fear. The ranch hands gathered from time to time, leaning on the fence to watch, in quiet disbelief. Some whispered bets on how soon the stallion would strike. But Elias never gave them the satisfaction. His patience was armor, his silence a form of faith. By the 3rd evening, the distance had shrunk. Diablo's eyes no longer burned with panic. He came within arm's length before retreating again, each approach slightly braver than the last. Elias didn't smile, didn't reach. He only breathed slow, steady breaths until their rhythm matched. He could feel it, the thin thread of connection stretching taut between them. Fragile but real. The sun began to sink, staining the horizon in streaks of gold and red. Elias rose, brushing the dust from his coat. "That's enough for today," he said softly. The stallion flicked his ears, but didn't move away. As Elias turned toward the gate, a low sound rumbled behind him, a soft whicker, hesitant but unmistakable. He froze, then slowly looked back. Diablo stood still, head tilted, eyes calmer than he'd ever seen them. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the beginning of something that might become it. Elias tipped his hat. "We're getting somewhere, partner." As he walked away, the faintest hint of warmth touched his chest. He didn't see Mason watching from the distance, arms crossed but expression unreadable. For the first time, the younger man said nothing. The night came quiet, save for the low murmur of the wind through the fences. In the dark, Diablo approached the spot where Elias had stood and lowered his head to the ground, breathing in the fading scent of the man's presence. The connection held, invisible but strong, waiting for morning to test its strength. The 3rd morning arrived heavy with clouds, a gray shroud draped across the Wyoming plains. The wind carried the scent of rain and dust, sharp enough to sting the nose. Elias McGraw stood beside the corral, hat in hand, studying the horizon where dark thunderheads crawled over the distant ridges. A storm was coming. He could feel it in the brittle ache of his joints, the same way he could sense unease in the stallion's restless pacing. Diablo's movements were tighter now, charged with something deeper than fear. It was as if the wind itself made him remember what it meant to be free. Elias stepped into the corral without a rope or stick. The men who had gathered by the fence fell silent. Mason Holt was there too, arms folded, raincoat flapping in the wind. "You sure this is the day?" Mason called out. "Storm's gonna hit any minute." Elias didn't look back. "It's been 3 days," he said evenly. "That's all you gave me." Lightning flickered far away, a thin white vein across the sky. The stallion's head shot up, ears pricked, nostrils wide. Elias slowed his steps, speaking low, his voice nearly lost to the rising wind. "Easy now, boy. We've come too far to start over." He stopped a few paces from the animal. The air between them was taut, humming with tension. Diablo's muscles rippled beneath his coat as he turned in a half circle, hooves sinking into the soft earth. His tail flicked like a whip. Elias kept his stance low, steady. "You're not trapped," he said quietly. "You're not my enemy." The stallion's gaze flicked toward him, wild, unblinking, and for a moment neither moved. Then, as thunder rumbled across the plains, Diablo bolted. The motion was sudden and violent, a blur of black muscle crashing through the corral's boundaries of fear. Elias didn't chase. He simply turned his body slightly, giving space, letting the horse find his own rhythm. The stallion circled him, faster and faster, until the air itself seemed to pulse with his power. Mason muttered under his breath from the fence, "He's going to get trampled." But Elias didn't back away. Instead, he dropped his hat to the ground and raised one hand, palm outward. His breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the stallion's hooves. When Diablo's path curved close, Elias took a step forward, not toward dominance, but invitation. "That's it," he said, his voice cutting through the wind like a steady drumbeat. "Let it out, son. Let it all out." The storm broke overhead, rain spilling in sudden sheets. The onlookers ran for shelter, shouting over the thunder. Elias stayed where he was, soaked through, hair plastered to his temples. The stallion's gallop slowed as the ground turned slick. Each stride flung mud into the air, until at last he stopped, sides heaving, eyes fixed on the old cowboy who hadn't moved. Elias took another step, then another, until they stood close enough for the rain between them to mist instead of fall. He lifted his voice above the storm. "You don't have to fight anymore." Something in those words, not the sound but the stillness behind them, cut through the stallion's trembling. He pawed once at the earth, snorted, then lowered his head just slightly, rain running off his muzzle in shining rivulets. Elias extended his hand again, slower than breath itself, until his fingers hovered inches from that dark, wet mane. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Diablo's nose brushed the man's palm, just the faintest touch, tentative, uncertain. Elias froze, afraid that even a breath might break the spell. The stallion lingered there, testing the warmth of human skin, before jerking back a step. Elias didn't reach for more. He simply smiled, a tired, genuine curve of relief. "That's enough," he murmured. "That's more than enough." The storm's fury began to fade, the thunder rolling into distance. Mason approached the fence again, his disbelief plain. "You're telling me that was the plan? Just stand there in the rain until he got bored." Elias turned to him, wiping water from his eyes. "It's not about making him give up," he said. "It's about showing him I won't leave when he's scared." Mason didn't reply. His gaze lingered on the stallion, who now stood calmer, ears forward, breathing steady. The men who had mocked Elias 2 days ago said nothing at all. That night, the rain stopped, leaving the plains washed clean under a pale crescent moon. Elias stayed in the corral long after everyone else had gone. He sat on the ground near the fence, legs stretched before him, humming softly. Diablo stood a few yards away, watching. The space between them no longer felt hostile. It was filled with quiet, with understanding. Elias looked up at the stars through the thinning clouds. "You remind me of her," he said softly. "She was wild, too. I thought love meant control back then. Thought I could shape something beautiful into something safe." His voice cracked, the memory raw even after decades. "I was wrong." He let the words hang in the still air. The stallion flicked his tail, gave a quiet snort, and stepped closer. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. He just let the moment breathe. By dawn, the two stood side by side, the light catching on the curve of Diablo's neck. When Mason returned from the bunkhouse, his expression shifted from confusion to quiet awe. The old man's hand rested against the stallion's shoulder, steady and unforced. Diablo didn't flinch. He stood tall and still, as if he'd found something familiar in the touch. Mason approached slowly. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "You actually did it." Elias shook his head. "No, he did." But the peace didn't last. By mid-morning, a truck rumbled down the dirt road, a hauler from the auction house, days early. The driver climbed out, brushing dust from his jacket. "Holt," he called. "Got word you had a wild one for pickup. We're a day ahead of schedule." Mason's jaw tightened. "You weren't supposed to come till tomorrow." "Got orders from the buyer," the man said. "They want the horse by tonight." Elias felt the weight of those words settle in his chest like a stone. Diablo, sensing the unease, tossed his head and backed away from the noise. Mason glanced at the old cowboy, torn between obligation and conscience. "If I don't send him, I lose the deal. That horse has nearly killed men, Elias. I can't risk him again." The old man's voice was low but firm. "He's not the same horse anymore." Mason hesitated, glancing at the stallion, who now stood quietly near Elias, steam curling from his nostrils in the cool air. There was doubt in the younger man's eyes, doubt fighting against years of hard business sense. "I can prove it," Elias said. "Give me until sundown. If he can't show you trust by then, I'll help load him myself." The words hung in the space between them. Mason finally nodded once slowly. "Sundown then." Elias turned toward Diablo, feeling the old ache of time press against his ribs. The day had become more than a test. It was the line between freedom and finality. He reached out, brushing his hand gently along the stallion's mane, and for the first time, the animal didn't pull away. "Looks like it's just you and me again, partner," Elias whispered. "Let's make it count." As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, light spilling gold across the plains, the old cowboy stood beside the stallion in the open corral, preparing for the last test that would decide them both. The air shimmered with promise and uncertainty, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The morning came with a golden light spilling over the canyon, painting the desert in shades of fire and honey. The stallion stood atop the ridge, his mane whipping against the wind, his frame healed but still scarred by memory. The wildness in his eyes had softened, no longer rage, but something else. Something like trust. Jack sat on a fallen fence rail, hat low over his brow, watching him with quiet pride. A week had passed since the stallion had led him near, truly near. Each day, Jack spoke less, and the horse listened more. It wasn't training, not really. It was two wounded souls learning how to stand again. The ranch hands had stopped calling it a fool's errand. They watched in silence as the old cowboy and the once untamable stallion shared a kind of wordless understanding. Still, the others knew what Jack didn't want to say. Time wasn't his ally. His cough had grown harsher, his steps slower. The desert winds carried whispers of his decline, yet he brushed them off with a wry smile. He had a promise to keep, to the boy he once was, to the horses he'd saved, and now to this wild creature who mirrored his own fading fire. That morning, Jack walked out to the corral with slow, deliberate steps. The stallion turned his head, ears flicking forward. For the first time, he didn't rear or snort when Jack approached. The old man stopped just short of the gate, leaning on the post for balance. "Well, partner," he said quietly, "looks like we both made it through the storm." The horse lowered his head slightly, breath puffing into the crisp air. Jack extended his trembling hand, and the stallion stepped forward, touching his muzzle gently against Jack's palm. The moment was fragile, pure, a bond sealed not by force, but by respect. Later that day, a storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds swallowing the sun. The ranch buzzed with hurried motion, ropes tied, equipment secured, but Jack seemed unbothered. He stood by the stable, watching the stallion pace restlessly within the corral. Something in the animal's posture told him it wasn't fear, it was instinct. The wind carried an eerie stillness before the first crack of thunder split the sky. The gates, weakened by rust and wind, trembled. Before anyone could reach them, lightning struck the far hill, sending a shockwave that rattled the ground. The gate burst open, and the stallion bolted into the open desert. "Jack, leave him, he's gone," someone shouted over the storm. But Jack was already in the saddle, atop his old mare, pushing through the rain that blinded his vision. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, but the thought of that wild creature alone, terrified, drove him forward. The storm became a wall of fury, tearing through the canyon, but Jack pressed on, calling out the stallion's name, not a command but a plea. He found him near the ridge where they first met, trapped between falling rocks and the rising floodwater. The stallion reared, hooves flashing in panic. Jack dismounted, stumbling through the mud. "Easy, boy," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You're not alone, look at me." The stallion froze, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with the memory of every fear that had shaped him. Jack took another step, then another, until he stood, within reach. The horse trembled but didn't move. "Remember," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain, "remember the word." And then, softly, he spoke it, the same word he had whispered that first night in the corral, the one that had calmed the wildness inside. Home. Something shifted in the stallion's eyes. The fight drained away, replaced by recognition. He lowered his head as Jack reached out, gripping the rope that had snagged on a rock. Together, they pulled free, stumbling toward higher ground as the flood roared below. The stallion pushed against Jack's shoulder, steadying him when he faltered. Man and beast climbed until they reached the top, where the rain finally eased into a mist. By dawn, the storm had passed. The desert glistened, washed clean, and the air smelled of earth and renewal. The ranch hands found them hours later, Jack sitting beneath the old oak, the stallion standing guard beside him. His hat rested on his knee, his eyes closed, face peaceful. He had fallen asleep there the way cowboys did after long rides, only this time he didn't wake. The stallion nudged him gently twice, then let out a low, mournful sound that echoed through the valley. They buried Jack on the ridge where the stallion had first defied the world, beneath the open sky he loved so much. The stallion stayed nearby, refusing to leave for days. When he finally did, he didn't vanish into the wild again. Instead, he lingered at the edge of the ranch, grazing near the fences, watching over the place that had become his home. Months passed, and the ranch changed hands, but the story of the wild stallion and the old cowboy spread across the county. Travelers came hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature no one else had ever tamed. Some swore they saw him standing by the oak at sunset, his head bowed toward the grave. Others said he roamed the pastures at dawn, his shadow long and proud against the light. No one dared to ride him again. He was more than a horse now. He was a legend, a spirit bound to the memory of the man who had seen the gentleness beneath his rage. One evening, years later, a young rancher's son found the stallion near the barn, old now, his once silver mane faded to white. The boy approached quietly, hand outstretched. "Hey there, fella," he said softly. The stallion lifted his head, eyes glimmering with the same wild fire Jack had seen long ago. And when the boy whispered a single word, "home," the stallion closed his eyes and lowered his head into the boy's hands. The wind carried through the canyon again, rustling the grass, whispering echoes of hooves and laughter long gone. In that sound lived the spirit of both, the wild and the wise, the unbroken and the gentle. Their story became part of the land, told in quiet voices by firesides, reminding all who heard it that even the wildest hearts can learn to trust again, if someone dares to whisper the right word. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.